the Quantum Academy crew. As you enter the school, we would like you to know who all the faces are who help make up our community and who dedicate their time to make the learning experience for students the best it can possibly be. From office staff to teachers to principal to our amazing night crew, we all impact the Quantum Academy community. Meet the staff of Quantum Academy. We have Mr. Kirkbride, our principal, our teaching staff, which includes Mrs. McKeon and Mrs. Carpenter in the 4th grade, Mrs. Sanchez and Mr. Benson in the 5th grade, Mrs. Resendiz and Mrs. Miramante Solosano in the 6th grade, and Mrs. Jackson and Mrs. Hansen in the 7th grade. In addition, we have support teaching staff, which includes Mrs. Fox, the instructional coach, Mr. Hannell, the site-based resource teacher, Mrs. Bess, our impact teacher, Mrs. Evans, our SAI and impact teacher, Mrs. Moretti, our PE teacher, and Mrs. Barlow, our music teacher. Here's Mrs. Bostwick, our office manager, Mrs. Meyer, our office clerk, Mrs. Mora, our family liaison, Mrs. Hansen, our school nurse, Mr. Nelson, our day custodian, Mrs. Reed, our speech and language therapist, Mrs. Hammett, our social worker, Mrs. French, our school psychologist, Mrs. Castellanos, in charge of nutrition services, Mrs. Fuller, our librarian, and our amazing night crew. In addition, in our backyard, we have our neighbors in the medical therapy unit. It takes all of us to make Quantum Academy an incredible place to learn.